Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1133rd New Social Environment. I'm Magali, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Anna Martine Whitehead and Rial Christian. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Anna Martine Whitehead creates performances on the homelands of the Council of the Three Fires. Their social their solo and collaborative work has been featured at venues like the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art, REDCAT, MoMA, and Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. Their work has been supported by the New England Foundation for the Arts, Graham Foundation, and more. Martine has written on blackness, queerness, and performance in publications like Queer, Dance, and Platforms. They're also the author of Treasure, My Black Rupture. Rial Christian is a writer, editor, and art historian based in Queens, New York. Her work explores issues related to identity, diasporas, ecology, media, and materiality. Her essays, interviews, and criticism have appeared in Bomb Magazine, The Brooklyn Rail, Art in America, Art Forum, and Art Papers, where she's a contributing editor. She has written text for numerous catalogs and anthologies, most recently Track Changes, a handbook for art criticism. Christian is the assistant director of editorial initiatives at the Verillis Center for Art and Politics at the New School. And with that, I will hand it over to Rial to get us started.
Thank you so much, Magali. And thank you to the whole team at the Rail, and to Chloe, for inviting us to be in conversation for today's new social environment. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you, Martine. It feels like our conversation has kind of been slowly developing over the past year or so. Um, and I'd love to just kind of start with you, kind of introducing us to the sort of key topic of today's conversation, force and opera in three acts. Um,
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, yes. And I am also receiving and giving back to you that it is really nice to talk with you today and to have been talking over the last little bit of time. Um, Force and Opera in Three Acts is a experimental slash emergent opera that sort of sits with a group of Black women in a prison waiting room. And, in the libretto, there is a story, which may or may not all happen on stage in performance, but in the libretto, there's a memory erasing mold that's like emerging out of the bathroom. And so these women are trying to decide what they're going to do about this. How are they going to escape this? Um, the reason why I just like when I just answered that question, I mean, basically what I just gave you is the log line. But I also am trying to think about what else this show is because I think that there's also it's about prison waiting rooms and it's also not specifically about prison waiting rooms. There's nothing necessarily in the show that signals scenically, there's nothing that signals prison, or even waiting room for that matter. Um, Although I think there's different ways with lighting and with some of the scenic design that we kind of point to that. But for us, as we were making it, there was a lot of intention around not wanting to represent spaces that some of us in the show have a lot of experience with and don't want to do it again. We like don't want to be in those spaces for fun. Um, so I think there's also, something about the show is also trying to think about other ways to talk about prison and our feelings in prison, without having to always talk about the horror of prison, but really just jump to the part where we get to talk about our feelings. Um, so that's also what the show is, yeah, is our feelings.
yeah, and you So you mentioned the libretto, which is this uh, text that you wrote in collaboration with Angel Bat-Dawid and one other collaborator. Um,
Yeah, it was so the work is co-composed with Angel and Ayana Woods and myself, and the libretto was just me
just
writing in a room.
right. And so you've kind of started to introduce some of the characters. The mold is not a character in the opera per se, but kind of this um, semi-omniscient or ever-present pseudo character that um, each of the sort of main three characters, the kind of core characters in the piece, begin to notice and slowly describe and kind of explicitly call out. But it begins as this kind of sort of overwhelming yet invisible presence.
Mm.
Um, and I think that connects really well to what you're saying about not wanting to replicate the a carceral space for the sake of doing so, as a way of not replicating a space of harm. Um, and maybe you could talk a bit about the architecture and the multiple iterations the performance has taken, which of course you've developed since 2019, um, and are now sort of premiering in this uh, across the country at these different venues that each have their own kind of idiosyncratic spaces that you're operating in.
Yeah. 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 And let me also just go back to the piece that you were talking about earlier with the mold. Um, yeah, the mold is, I think the mold in this work is actually kind of exists as almost in some ways a foil to this thing that is sung repeatedly throughout the show, which is I know it because I feel it.
Mm.
Um, and this I so there's this like ongoing motif throughout the show of how do we know something? What are ways to know a thing? Um, Audre Lorde is also quoted in the libretto, and I that this idea of like a kind of like erotic knowledge is we're pulling this from Audre Lorde, um, and I think the mold is like in some ways it's like literally mold in a prison bathroom. If you've ever been to prison, the bathrooms are just really so foul always. And there's just like weird stuff in there, like old things that are not supposed to be there. Um, so there's like that literal idea of mold, but then also this idea of a thing that's sort of like grows and grows and can cover everything and can almost like be in this parasitic relationship where it's just like eating up space and energy. Um, yeah, that kind of emerged in the libretto as a sort of way to like think alongside or sort of juxtapose against this sort of deep innate awareness of things being wrong, things being long, things being long and wrong. Um, and also I also have this uh ambivalent relationship to the mold concept in the libretto too, because we also use things like lichen as movement prompts in the work, like the way that lichen works and the way that mold works and moss and fungal things work, um, have actually been really useful in how we think, especially about choreography in the show, as a kind of like generative, uh, I don't want to say atemporal, but really like a very different time scale, um, horizontal, low to the ground, clinging. Yeah, this has all been like useful for us in thinking about, especially choreography. Um, So yeah, so I'm like balancing these different ways of dealing with this mold character concept. Um, and I guess that also helps me talk about doing this work in different spaces. So we've been sort of performing it this year on tour, but we've also been performing different variations of it, versions of it over the la last few years. Um, and there's pretty consistently been this um, ongoing thing of like journeying somewhere. So whether it's the dancers creating this sort of processional just with themselves as this thing which we call assembly. That's the name of the movement score, but it's almost like a tumbleweed sort of that travels through space. Um, that's been one way for us to kind of ground in the space and touch all of it in a very possessive sort of way, like a cat like rubbing up against stuff. Um, but also something that has happened in every space we've performed in this year is I don't want to say too much because I don't want to give things away, but we kind of journey the audience through different uh different parts of the theater or different parts of the neighborhood or we just try to get the audience to move through, especially move through the kind of bowels and the sort of like not presentable parts of the space. Um, Not really for like it's not really like I mean, the reason why we're doing that is because, well, there's a number of reasons why we're doing that. One reason why is because, especially in more traditional theaters, this isn't really true at the Chocolate Factory here in Queens, but um, in some of the more traditional theaters that we've done this in, it's very, um, it's like really striking how they run like many arts institutions, like art museums and many of these spaces run in ways that they share practices with prison culture. I'll say that. Um, Sometimes they share a lot with prisons, actually, including employees. There's a certain kind of security culture that is very that crosses across, especially museums, where you have these things that have to be guarded, these objects that must be guarded, and prisons. There's a lot that's shared. So part of why we do that traveling through the space is to kind of uh, help have the feeling of going through these sort of secure checkpoints or these spaces that you know that kind of make the thing run, I guess. So that's something that we've tried to do or that we have done throughout the tour. And also for me, architecture is just like an opportunity. So it's been fun to sort of reimagine how are we going to think about how are we going to think about this particular theater as a panopticon like structure? Like what can we use in here that gives us certain um that we can like reify this idea of being able to surveil everyone or not knowing if you're being surveilled. Um, or this sense that for me as a visitor in prison is very familiar, this sense of like confusion, like where am I or how did I get here or where is this person taking me to? Um, all of those things. And I think, yeah, I mean, all these architectures have it in them. You just gotta like coax it out or find it. Sometimes it's not even that hard. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, actually.
Maybe we could flip through some of the other iterations of force. So that first slide, I think, was kind of the one of the early iterations of it, kind of one of the previews. And then what we're seeing here in these next slides is our is kind of documentation from the final versions of the opera at I hate to say final, but you know at the MCA Chicago, which is where it debuted, and then REDCAT in Los Angeles, and the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art, um, at the time based art festival. And all of this is from earlier this year, and then you'll be presenting it as part of your fellowship at the Yerba Center for Art and Politics at the Chocolate Factory in Queens. Um, and shout out to my colleagues Adrienne Ume and Ariel Pira, who I think are in the audience, and have been organizing it. Yeah, I want to go back to this question of architecture, and something you've already sort of touched on is how the ways in which prison infrastructures replicate colonial architectures, which we also see replicated in um, across various institutions, and um, in the ways that colonial architecture was specifically created to restrict movement of the colonial body and to create clear sight lines for surveillance to um, which was also transposed onto eventually onto the plantation and then into the prison. Um, and you've talked about the ways that you're using movement in your work as a way of kind of counteracting the this restriction that the architecture is meant to impose. And I think in Scenes of Subjugation, Sadie Hartman talks about how movement was prescribed on the plantation in order to orchestrate the times and places in which Black people could gather to express joy or to mourn or to express pleasure or to be angry together. And we have all of these kind of primary documents of the ways that enslaved people would find ways of kind of slipping away from the master's gaze. Um, and I'm curious to hear you talk about the ways in which you're conceptualizing movement, which you've already sort of touched on, but also how it how that conceptualization maybe translates across different disciplines from performance to installation to teaching.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess, yeah, maybe starting just with thinking about, there's a lot in there that you just said.
Sorry.
No, it's good. Um, I think starting with thinking about theater, because that's what I'm working in, and like physical space of the theater. Um, there's a way that let me take it back. Let me say this. I'm really, for a while, I've been really interested in the body as a site of knowledge that can make itself apparent differently in different spaces. And that there's this kind of conversation that can happen between the body and affect and the actual architecture of a space um, that is a source of knowledge that's available to us. Why do I feel this way in this building? And it reminds me of the way I felt over here in this other building. Or why do I feel this way um, on this block when I see, you know, a CCTV camera? Why does it remind me of when I see a speeding ticket camera on a different block, even though they're two different, what is happening in my body in relationship to space and sight? Um, there's information in there for us. And I think this is like really apparent with things like theater spaces, because in theater all the time, we have this thing that we do where we'll sort of be like, oh, you have to kind of like, I mean, I think we do this especially with audience seating, where you sort of, if you play with the audience seating too much, you kind of fuck up the whole thing, because there's this implicit and explicit understanding that when you walk into the theater, the audience has to know what to do. And the way that they know what to do is that they see the thing, they see the structure of the space, and it is somehow familiar to them. And so that they understand they're being cued to sit down and probably like be quiet and watch the show. And so the more that you kind of like just something as specific as seating, the more that you kind of like fuck with the seating, the more that you confuse the body memory of going to the theater and knowing what to do, right? So this is like this happens all the time. It happens in classrooms. Um, and it happens in prison, right? We like even if you've never been to prison, there's something about seeing like a door with a bunch of bars on it that you kind of know like this is a this is a place where bad things happen and they're kept here. Things are kept here and there's violence here. Um, yeah, I'm gonna like travel away from your thing about the colonial architectures for a second, but if I forget to come back, just bring me back. Um, I think this thing about these like different sort of the way that these different architectures inform a sort of like somatic response, for me has only become more apparent in the years since 2020. And that is because my life and my work and my life before 2020, um, I really was spending a lot of time interfacing with prisons and jails. I had a couple of people in my life who were incarcerated, and I was also working inside a Chicago area prison pretty like basically every week for years. And so I was just like, if I wasn't physically in one, I was like energetically in relationship to them a lot for 5 or 6 years. And then COVID happened, COVID hit and is still happening. And the prison that I was going to, the most Stateville prison, went on to as like semi-permanent lockdown. Um, and uh the two people I was closest to who were locked up both got released with like between 2020 and 2021. Um, and another thing happened, which is that I became an assistant professor. And so I stopped going to energetically and physically going to prison every day, and I started going to school every day. And um, just to be really clear, I'm not saying that academia is the same as prison, but there are things physically that were very familiar to the point of being triggering. And it actually I think it took me a little while to understand what was going on and why I was having this reaction. Um, but then I started to see how just in very basic ways and also in very sort of like existential ideological ways, there's a mirror here. Um, that is not specific to my school. I think it's this feeling can happen anywhere. I think where you're in a place that's sort of running on some sort of, institutional framework that exists to manage um, capital and uh, kind of like surplus capacity. This is a Ruth Wilson Gilmore idea of prisons coming into the era of mass incarceration to sort of manage these surpluses, surplus labor and surplus finance capital and surplus state capacity. And and that doesn't just happen with prisons, that happens with a lot of municipal spaces, and it also happens with private schools, which is what I teach in. Um, and yeah, so I think I just started to notice this feeling, and then I started to notice it in like these really kind of intimate ways too, where it was like this sense of like all these, like, man, all these Black and brown women are working so hard to take care of some people. Like, we're all doing this thing that I also saw us all doing in prison waiting rooms, which is like trying to slip through this really at best uncomfortable and at worst really violent um, series of series of rules through some kind of bureaucracy. We're trying to slip through this bureaucracy to actually do the thing that we came to do, which is take care of some people. Um, and in school, it's your students, right? Um, and when you're going to visit someone, it's whoever you're going in to visit, or if you're teaching or whatever. So yeah, I that for me has become more and more clear that that there's this thing that can happen across space, and okay, so I'll try to connect it to the colonial thing. So that feeling, which is like an actual feeling that I'm having now in real time, I think is also building off of this thing that I started studying in 2017, which is this lineage of architecture uh, through through time. I mean, through I guess it depends on how far back you want to go, but for a very long time, there's this lineage of architectural topologies that build off of each other in the Western world. Um, that for me, the most interesting kind of contact point is the point of slave castles and contemporary prisons. Slave castles, contemporary prisons, and then there's also like a housing, like, yeah, house, living space piece of it that's interesting to me too. Um, yeah. You want me to do, should I say more about that part of it, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I mean, I guess why that relationship is the most interesting to me is because it's also the most obvious. Like, um, the relationships between prison in the United States, especially in slavery, it's like not, this is like something we know about, and many others have written and made movies about and stuff like that. So it feels both like very clear. I mean, it's also very clear because when you go to prison, you see a lot of Black people who have chains, who are wearing chains and are essentially in dungeons more or less. Um, so it's just like visually, it's very clear. And I think we understand that there's a relationship there. But for me, the thing that was really interesting was seeing how um, architecturally these castles, which were built throughout Africa and especially West Africa as part of the slave trade, which were castles, but they were dungeons to hold Africans, captive Africans, and they were also forts. Um, they also often house the military, or at least the like top brass of the whatever sort of mercenary or military group that was there to kind of protect the assets. Um, these architectures specifically, when I started looking at them, specifically reminded me of Stateville Prison in particular. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, Stateville is built where you actually do go upstairs to get to where management is. You like most of Stateville is cells, and there's sort of like this vast expanse of cells, but then you also have to like literally ascend up above where those are to get to where management is, and where like the warden's office would be, or any of these things.
Yeah.
So there's like that actual structural thing that is similar. But also why specifically Stateville was reminiscent for me of these castles is because Stateville was built um, like when I think it was like 1860, somewhere between mid and late 19th century, Stateville was built. And it was built in this style that you see actually a lot of the 19th century, especially the 19th century limestone structures in the Chicago area, were like this. I don't know what it's called. I don't think it's called neo-Gothic, but maybe it is. But it's that, maybe that's neo-Gothic. It's that, it's like we're basically building a castle. It's
Hmm.
like, it looks like a castle. The prison right before Stateville, the prison, I should say not right before, sorry. There was a prison called Joliet Prison that is like right down the street from Stateville Prison, which was built, which was which was what housed a lot of people who eventually wound up at Stateville, and was eventually decommissioned. Um, Joliet like truly looks like a castle. Stateville looks a little less like a castle, but it still has a lot of castle-like qualities. Um, and that felt, I think the first time I went to a slave castle, I went to Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, and I had this memory of Cape Coast the first time I went to Stateville that was just, I haven't really gone to that many castles in my life, you know? Um, so it's just strange that the two castles that I've been to are uh, a slave castle and a prison.
Yeah. I mean, you've talked about, yeah, kind of this recurring presence of our, um, I don't know, appearance of the prison as a kind of particular, um, I don't know, system or kind of layout of, I don't know, um, I'll say system, and how that kind of replicates itself across the dungeon, the torture chamber, cathedrals, and checkpoints. Um, yeah, and how these spaces intersect, both in society and kind of what you're talking about, and the kind of felt experience of navigating these spaces, and why there's this eerie feeling that you've um, experienced one space before, and when you haven't necessarily been there, how you can kind of connect these spaces in your mind. Um, and yeah, sorry, that was just an interjection.
And you can connect them in your body too. I mean, and I think that's also just as like a little aside too. I think something that always felt really deep for me when I was going to prison every week, is that my body would start to feel when I would leave when I would leave the prison, my body would feel depleted. And um and I remember once sharing that with some of the people I was working with inside Stateville that I like always felt like really sore and stiff and also really hungry, like I needed nutrients. It was very weird. Yeah, it's like hunger thing. And I remember talking with them about the like their experience living in prison and the ways that their bodies were struggling, like they were physically not feeling good in their bodies um, after years and years of being there. Uh, which is just like there's something really profound about this thing that can happen where you can like really know. I mean, you can't really know. I mean, I don't know what it's like to live in prison, but I would have these like moments of like this feeling is a feeling that maybe could give me some insight, a little tiny bit of insight into what it could be like. I know it's a really bad feeling that I don't like. Um,
And you also sort of explored this in your piece Notes on Retreat, and I think we have a picture from it. And um, this takes us out of the prison into a kind of adjacent space where you're referencing Harriet Jacobs' loophole of retreat, the crawl space she lived in on the plantation where she was kept and escaped from, but stayed in order to remain close to her children and kind of watch them through um, this small crevice or kind of aperture she was able to find, and but was in this very um, this space that kind of approximately mirrors or replicates that of the prison cell in its restrictiveness.
Yeah. And it's like literal dimensions. Like it's basically the same dimensions.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's the image with the I wish I could see the thumbnails, but let's see.
That one. It's the
Yeah,
one right before this one.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's that one.
And then you also populated it with books. Could you maybe speak about this project?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so Harriet Jacobs lived in this attic for 7 years while she was trying to get away from the plantation owner, and also trying to get her kids out of there too. Um and she was able to hide in this attic, and it's just an interesting, it was like a really transformative space for her, as she wrote about it in her autobiography. I mean, she physically transformed because she was in an attic that was only 3 feet high. So like her physical body transformed. But I think it also, for her, at least the way she writes about it, it seems like it really it put her in a place that was not exactly the place of being free, but it was a place that was not being a slave. It was somewhere else that was not enslaved. And yeah, I mean, I think that was very important for her to know that she could not be a slave. She could be something other than a slave, which is what she was in this place. Um, and the 7 by 9 thing, so it's 7 by 9, and then it's 3 feet high. And the average US prison cell is like 6 by 8 feet or something like this. So they're very similar in length and width. And I felt really curious about how she survived. I mean, she wrote about it, but I like, it's really unimaginable. Um, and I honestly, it feels equally, well, I was gonna say it feels equally unimaginable how one survives in a 6 by 8 cell. But I think the thing that she was writing about was, I think the piece of the way that she tr is being transformed by the space is actually so important, because I don't think that she survives. I think she almost like she becomes something else. I mean, she literally becomes a non-slave. And the way that she writes about it, it's like a transformation, actually. It's like she's becoming something else.
Yeah. And that kind of relates back to what you were saying about, I don't know, to bring it back to force, the mold is kind of doing this too, and kind of in the ways that it's changing people, the people being kept in this space, physiologically, and psychologically. Um,
Yeah.
we've talked about sort of these in between spaces, and how you want to distinguish between the waiting room and then the prison itself. And so I don't want to conflate the two, and how you're really speaking specifically to the waiting room as this kind of interstitial space that can, um, even in institutions like uh, sort of within academia or within hospitals, can also be spaces that enact particular forms of violence um, against the people who occupy it. And so you're speaking about waiting rooms both in the sense of the prison, the hospital, the court, um, as these kind of um, way stations almost. But you've also talked about um, how um, in this kind of in that nondescript space, there can be kind of other forms of mm, enacting refusal, or kind of the
Yeah.
space of nothingness being a space, being a state of indeterminacy, but also a potential state of refusal for Black and brown women and femmes that attend to and occupy these spaces.
Yeah, and I don't for some reason I never connected these two, but I think just because we're looking at this and you were just talking about what you were talking about, I think this thing of like that where Harriet Jacobs stayed for 7 years, that attic, and this thing of like that she really she like now I kind of now it really makes me want to read the book again just to like really remember how is she writing about it because I really do feel like there's something it's almost like a what is it called like when you go into a cocoon but it's not beautiful. I mean it's like awful what happened to her in that attic. I mean it was a disabling experience for her. And she was completely cut off from her children and all these so it's not like I think that's also why the way she writes about it has been so impactful for especially so many Black women and Black queer people who have written about Harriet Jacobs is because this identifying as a sort of like identifying this moment and space and time where you're are you free? You're not a slave, but it's not clear what you are, but you know you're not a slave, which is good. But there's other things that aren't good that are happening. And I'm just like for the first time making this connection between that and the waiting room space, which is which is also an interstitial it's basically an attic, you know. It's like what is I mean, it's like actually basically an attic, you know. I mean, in this attic, she had she had one hole in the attic where she was able to look and see her children. And she was able to watch her children grow up through the hole, which is mind-boggling to think about. That she couldn't talk with them, but she watched them grow through the hole. What a like fucking wild metaphor for the people who be in that waiting room space, you know, where you're sort of like you get these like I don't know, 1 to 3 hour chunks every what, week, month, year, however often you can get there to see this person, to like go and do whatever you can to participate in this person's life, to participate in each other's life, which is like not really, I mean, it is a kind of participation, but it's like so truncated and, you know, it's like looking through a peephole. Um, and this thing happens to you. I'll speak for myself. I actually shouldn't speak. I should really speak for myself. This thing happened for me. Um, so I should say this opera force is me. This is me. All the characters are me. So that feels, I just feel like I need to say that because if you see it, I just really wanted to be clear, like this is me talking, and somebody else might have a completely different version of the story that they need to tell. Um, for me, what happened in that space, waiting room space, is I thought, what am I doing here? And sometimes when we were just talking about this last night, Riel, because I'm reading this John Edgar Wideman book, Brothers and Keepers, and he's like really, it's like really, I don't even know how I feel about it, but it's a very intense way that he's dealing with his respectability issues, and his brother is incarcerated. And yeah, he has that thing too where he's like, and I on some level had this thing, especially going in as a teacher, where you know, there's like a hierarchy in the waiting room. There's like there's like lawyers are number one, hot shit. There's um the Christian missionaries, which feel like Christian missionaries and teachers kind of feel like they're on the same wavelength. You know, we get certain privileges, I guess. And then there's the like regular visitors. Um, and I've been both a regular visitor and a teacher. And I will say that there's something you feel as a teacher that you don't have to deal quite so much with that feeling of I am I am also just here to visit someone. But you are just there to visit some people. I mean, the work of a teacher in prison is there's so much work that you're doing. Teaching is only part of it. You're also like connecting people to a kind of life, and a kind of livingness. But when you go in as just a regular social visitor, um, yeah, I should say when I have gone in as a regular social visitor, I have felt, what am I doing here? And I have felt, I have seen myself in the people that I'm standing in line with, and I have talked with them. I mean, I've, I'm standing in line. We're all standing in line. We all fucking signed up for the hour, for the, hour that we were supposed to come in, and we all did this. We all put our coins in a plastic bag. We all did the same exact shit, and we're all here, and we all hope we get at least a couple of hours with this person. And it's very transformative. It's like, and it's not good, but it's something else that I'm not able to articulate with language. Um, the thing that you're talking about, the kind of like collective refusal that can happen. I don't even, I think sometimes it's like maybe kind of a conscious thing, but I think mostly what happens is that people find themselves in the same place at the same time, and they look out for each other, and in a place that, doesn't really want anybody to look out for anybody. So that's where the refusal piece comes in. Um, yeah. I
Yeah.
don't, that was a little rambly, but I think I just like kind of made this connection between those two spaces.
Yeah. I thought you always knew that connection was there.
Whoops. Well, I didn't.
No, because no, no, I think the way that you're kind of situating the space is, yeah.
Everybody knows this, Martine.
Obviously. No. Yeah, I mean, no, what you're saying kind of makes me going back to the libretto you reference, Imnarbeze Phillips Zong, this book length meditation or lamentation really on that kind of weaves between poetry and prose and um, response to the Zong massacre, which was this when enslaved African Africans were thrown overboard by the ship's owners, and it's this moment that's famously captured in William Turner's The Slave Ship, and they were thrown overboard for insurance. Um, and Philip responds to this horrific event through this kind of broken language and silence and intervals. And I think the way you're utilizing these in-between spaces throughout your practice kind of relates back relates back to the language itself and the, like you said, the kind of impossibility of describing these things in um, in a kind of in a sense that translates the bodily experience to language. Um, but I think that so the libretto is of course, the text from the opera, and then the footnotes become this other space where you're bringing in all of these other all of these other scholars and voices and conversations and experiences that you've had in that have led to this work, and um, that I hope will lead to other work as well. Um, and we talked a little last night about how um, well, in Philip's work, the piece is performed in these kind of long durational readings, and there's a certain parallel durationality, which is not a word, of these readings and the development of force, both in the kind of physical presentation of it or the visual presentation of it, but also in the ways that it's been developed over the years with the same group of collaborators, and these kind of iterative experiences that you've all had together.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Is there a question in there? Sorry.
No, I mean, it's kind of a general observation that I hope you'll respond to. I don't know if you want to talk about the process of collaborating and kind of what these different because it's not, I mean, there's the part that we see the public presentation of it, but then there's also all these other things kind of feeding into the work that are happening privately and publicly that, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a journey. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm really I have to say that's something that I feel very um it's very close to my heart, the way that this show has happened, because um it like is the waiting room, you know. Um I mean it's not, but it is. It has echoes. I'll say it has echoes. Um we I I'm proud of the show, but the show is really just one part of a very, very long process. And the process has involved like profound levels of care, mutual care. Um, it's involved uh, it's involved like attempts towards accountability, which sometimes are really manifest as like really beautiful versions of transformative justice, and at other times have actually been really messy and kind of failed. Um, I think any it feels to me specific to performance too, but I might be wrong. But any kind of like performance based ensemble that works together for this long, I think there's you end up all up in each other's stuff, you know, and you end up really really caring for each other, and also sometimes really hurting each other, and also trying to figure out what do we do, what do we want to do, to hold each other accountable for that. Um, and yeah, all of that stuff. And I guess like kind of what I was talking about last night around when we were sort of, well, when I was sort of processing what happens now with shifting, or maybe not shifting, deepening political climate um, and different funding interests, let's say. What happens to work like this, which is very expensive and takes time to make, and takes like material resources to make. That I feel, you know, I'm like excited to be doing it, and I also don't for me in the foreseeable future, I don't see how I could, like I just don't see how I could do this. Like if I were to start Force right now, it would look completely different. I just don't even, I mean, literally where I got the bulk of the funding from for the show is no longer being funded by the NEA. So there's just, you know, this element to it, but I do feel really grateful, and I also feel really proud that we were able to do this sort of mutual care work in a way where we were also paying ourselves to do it. That always felt like a like an important piece of this particular project. Um, and and also that like care work, but also this kind of like self-care stuff that had to happen, and making this through COVID, where people were family members were dying. People had to go, people had to like plan funerals and do this kind of stuff, and that we were able to create a system, an institution, a temporary institution where we didn't have paid medical leave, but we could go. We could like go do what we needed to do and come back to the work and it would still be there for us. And part of that is like being able to pay people, but it's also being able to sustain the project. I think having this work go on for 5 years allowed people to have lives that they needed to tend to.
Yeah, and that I also wanted to bring up Suki Bronfman and the Dancing Through Prison Walls program, which is this kind of ongoing project where she works with both incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people to create these um, scores and performances. And I think the COVID aspect is really important as well. And for people who have either been incarcerated or for people, those of us who have known people who are incarcerated and that um, that separation kind of aids in this in the impossibility of imagining the prison as a physical space, but also in the impossibility of imagining a world kind of beyond it, a world where that space doesn't need to exist, where we don't need to continue replicating these spaces of harm and these architectures of these kind of restrictive um, architectures of confinement and containment. Um, yeah, I had wanted you to read from the libretto, um, but I also wanted to see if there are any questions that might have come up.
Amazing conversation. Really, it's bringing up so much for me. There are a couple of questions. I'll ask mine first. I was I think a lot about how carceral systems are replicated, but never really thought about it in the sense of like how our body responds in different spaces. So I really appreciate that framing. That wasn't my question, but yeah, I really appreciated hearing y'all kind of delve into that aspect of it. But I was wondering about the waiting room, like the liminal space of the waiting room as a place for hope and just like a place for radical imagination where despite the hardships that you face in the waiting room and just in carceral systems and places as a whole. I guess for you, Martine, like you keep going back to teach and visit. Like, how do you reconcile with that? Like, it is hard, but you still do it. And I kind of see that as coming from a place of viewing this space as a hopeful place.
Thank you for that. Well, I guess I have so much to say, so I don't want to go on and on. So one thing that I want to say is that I don't know that the waiting room is a hopeful place. Um, I mean, someone might say that it is. But for me personally, I don't think I have felt that feeling there. I felt a lot of other feelings, but not hopefulness. I do think that's something that can, not always, but can happen in those places is that you can practice doing the things that are actually what we need to do to get through this hellscape that we're currently in. Um, like you can actually practice mutual aid with each other, like in a real way. Um, but yeah, so that is good. But I don't know that personally I have felt the feeling of hope. I also have to say that I for me going inside, I actually think it's really hard. Um, it's actually really hard. I it the feeling I have had when I've gone in, both both for like a social visit and to teach is I don't have hope, but I have excitement, I have anticipation, I have like, ooh, I want to hear what so and so has to say about what's it called, or like, oh, I can't wait to catch up with so and so, or whatever it is. Like all these feelings of like, you know, I'm looking forward to seeing someone, those feelings that you get when you're doing that. Um, but it's prisons are always out of the way. They don't have really food that you want to eat. It's hard to even get water. They don't really have bathrooms. You feel policed and you feel like you're in prison when you're there. They do body scans. They check under your tongue. They check through your hair. You feel like a prisoner and you feel like you're being surveilled because you are. Um, if you're on your period, you're like, is there going to be a bathroom that I can deal with this? They're horrible places. So I actually think it's very hard to go. Um, and I think that's part of what I was trying to think through with this mold in the opera that's erasing people's memories because it is actually there's like this really weird there's this it's not weird. There's a really complicated thing. I don't even know if it's complicated. There's something that happens for me, and I don't think I'm the only one, but I will speak for myself that there's something that happens where I want and need to be in touch with whoever it is that I need to be in touch with, but I also desperately do not want to go to that place. And um you could just not go, you know? And people do it all the time. I've done it. I've done it. I've had people who I've completely fallen out of touch with because I was like, I'm too busy or I don't want to do that. I don't want to do it. Um, yeah. So I don't that was I don't I'm not really sure if that really got to what your question was, but I guess I just felt like I needed to say that.
Yeah, no, thank you. You definitely answered my question, and I appreciated you touching on kind of being able to do very tangible mutual aid work while in these spaces. So thank you. The next question is from Chloe. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Martine and Riel, for this conversation. I appreciate it so much, and it's been really illuminating to listen to. Um, I have a simple question, but I'm genuinely curious what your fellowship with Viralist enlightened about your work, Martine.
Oh, well, Fearless. Okay, I don't. I just like I gotta hype up the Vera Listener. They were so cool. Like they really were down from the beginning to support in all kinds of ways. And because I see Adrian on the screen, I'm also gonna say this is also like not deep, but it actually is really deep. Adrian was so incredibly helpful with managing my budget and like understanding how to make it work, like make it actually make sense. Um, which, yeah, I guess that's not like very interesting to talk about, but actually nobody does that. So that's like another thing. If we ever get back to funding the arts and funding performance, I really hope that people will try to also like make helping artists understand how to run a budget be a part of their funding structures because nobody does that. And then you're just like, am I getting taxed on what? And also, how do I pay these 14 people when I've got five different income streams? Um, so yeah, that was an amazing thing. But generally the Vera Listener, I mean, they brought me out for this collaboration with Angel Batouid, who is a co-composer of the opera, but also has her own. She's an incredible musician in her own right. And her band, Sisters of the Nitty Gritty, we came out and we did this fun, kind of like chaotic, wild collaboration, um, which then ended up some of the members of Sisters ended up joining force over time, which was just kind of a beautiful organic thing that happened through that. So yeah, it's been lovely to work with the VLC.
Thank you for that answer.
I think that was it for our questions. Riel, if you want to introduce the reading.
Yeah. So Martine, I have a few footnotes in mind, and you can choose which one you want to read. Um, the first was footnote 3, where you talk about um, kind of the third part of it, where you talk about reclaiming the language of global terror for the purposes of Black joy. Um, and this is where you also talk about two of the characters in Force, the light, which is the character that or the light and the shadow, I guess, which are the two characters that you physically play in the opera. Um, Another one was footnote 20, where you talk about Nikki Giovanni and um, Nina Horn, and this dialect that has become our new obsession of the Black transatlantic. Um, and the third, which I'm leaning to the most, is footnote 39, where you kind of talk about um, a lot of the points you've already brought up about, um, well, I don't want to give too much away, but sort of the somatic solidarity is what you've called it before. And
Um, let me find 39. Oh, that's nice. I want to honor your desire for me to read 39, but I also really want to read number 3. Can
okay.
I do both of them?
Yeah, right? Yeah.
All right, I'll do both and then I'll try not to drag it on. Okay, because I just love number 3 because I also want people to I'll just read it. Oh, sorry, let me just read it. Okay, so this is footnote number 3, and this goes to one of the characters whose name is Warren in Loving Hustle. So this is the cast list. Warren in Loving Hustle, who's a matriarch accounting for her people with knowledge passed down through gossip. And here's the footnote. John Berger begins with, "The dead surround the living. The living are the core of the dead," end quote. From there, he goes on to explain the ways this fundamental relationship, in which the dead are composed of the living, is continuously misunderstood and mischaracterized by the living, for whom, unlike the dead, time is a thing. But what if time were no thing? And then there's a drawing in the footnote, which is actually this tattoo. Berger asks, what is the relationship of the dead to what has not yet happened, to the future? He is asking about imagination. To understand with deeper nuance the contours of his question, I refer to Gabrielle Seville's interrogation of the Bakongo cosmological spiritual system of movement through realms and her application of this cosmogram to knowingness. And actually, maybe I'll just use this tattoo. So basically, it's a cross between the circles. Um, and on the top of the cross says living world. And to the left says death, spirit world on the bottom, and then birth. Reclaiming the language of global terror for the purposes of Black joy, Seville explains known knowns and known unknowns in the upper right and left quadrants, respectively, and unknown knowns and unknown unknowns in the lower right and left quadrants. This recuperative act provokes the questions. Could this realm, the physical one some of us call reality, the one above the x-axis, be better termed the realm of knowns? Could the spiritual realm, below the x-axis and called all manner of things, including spirit, faith, superstition, voodoo, be more accurately termed the realm of unknowns? Then the realm of unknowns. M is in parentheses. Then within this realm, the realm of knowns, we'd find both known knowns and known unknowns. We'd find everything from Donald Rumsfeld to Megan the Stallion's pantsuit. We'd find our flesh and the flesh of our parents and our children. Within the realm of unknowns, we'd find all the rest and beyond. We'd find all of our wildest dreams and the nightmares our ancestors didn't pass down in story. Again, we'd find our flesh. We'd find the unspeakable, the unnameable. In which case, timeless spaciousness and inevitability, as indicated in our formless force character, the blinding light of the swamp, might be thought of as more than a spiritual element coming to express itself in the physical. Inasmuch as blinding light is a border walker, they are too then the embodiment of that which we do not remember knowing, as well as that which we do not know we know. And the citations are John Berger's 12 Theses on the Economy of the Dead and Gabrielle Seville's Experiments in Joy. And then I'll read 39. Angela Davis says, walls turned sideways are bridges. She's talking about solidarity. Once you've lived in a land of walls, been one of those people defined by the wall, regardless of where you go, you remain tethered to your wall-defined place and people. It is very disorienting. One might say the definition of a life lived in abstraction, to find oneself on the outside of the wall, still tethered to the inside. That tethering is solidarity. It is remittances, it is eSIMs, it is JPay accounts. What is it to leave one's home of walls only to turn oneself into a bridge back home? What is it to make one's home on this side of the wall strange, more like a bridge to that other side? Davis is articulating the ways in which we must all be bridges, how a prison wall here is not at all like a border wall in Jerusalem. And as far as mapping carceral space, see also Mabel Wilson, Leopold Lambert, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. In her essay on Palestine, G4S, and the prison industrial complex, Davis makes plain the myriad ways the security firm G4S, which is the third largest private corporation in the world, bridges prisons, schools, and apartheid. G4S runs girls' academies, prisons, and deportation transportation hubs. G4S supplies equipment and services to Israeli checkpoints along the Palestinian West Bank apartheid wall. I like the Davis quote as a reminder that walls can be shaped, can be turned sideways. Yet walls turned upright can be anything. Walls made of concrete or steel, but also sometimes made of roads, bridges, bridges as walls, or of surveillance technology, or of the law, economy, or language. Walls are not always material, nor are bridges, and thank goodness, real bridges can be bombed. But bridges, like walls, also exist inside of us. We can work to sideways our own walls. We can extend ourselves into bridges to carry us back home, and we do it all the time. What else would you call traveling dozens or hundreds of miles to a prison week after week, month after month, to share a small, redacted, across a table for a few brief hours? And the citations are Angela Davis on Palestine, G4S, and the prison industrial complex. Um, and yes, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking for that.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful and the perfect way to close this out. Thank you, Martine and Rial. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with architect Sharon Johnston and Rail architecture editor Niall Greenberg on the occasion of Candida Hofer, Europa America at Sean Kelly Gallery, Los Angeles. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for this
so
great
much.
conversation.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Martine and
Thank
Rial.
you, Diana.
That was
Thank you,
amazing.
Rial.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much, you
you.
guys.
And go see the show at Chocolate Factory Theater, November
well-
22nd and 23rd.
Yes, congratulations. Please go see the
Congratulations.
show, everyone. Thank
Bye,
you. Thank you
everybody.
both.
Take care.
Keep up the good
Thank
work.
you.
Bye.
Bye.